genetics is not telling you what's happening now. It's the filter through which what everything is happening now is passes through to express into its final form. And genetics will tell you how to optimally live, and also what are the risks that one is inherited that if you don't address now, you don't find out what those are now. You will find out eventually.
Welcome to the Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast, the podcast for high achievers who want to stay sharp, focused, and full of energy despite their diagnosis. With your host, National Board Certified Functional Medicine Health Coach, Julie Michelson, where Julie helps you take your power back from autoimmunity. And now here's your host, Julie Michelson.
Welcome back to the Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast. I'm your host, Julie Michelson. And today we are joined by Dr. Sam Shay, Doctor of Chiropractic and Institute of Functional Medicine certified provider. Dr. Sam solves health puzzles for busy, health-conscious moms, mompreneurs, and adults with Asperger's so they can exit survival mode and re-enter community. Known as the friendly lab nerd, Dr. Shay specializes in functional lab and genetics analysis for data-driven results. Dr. Shay is also a stand-up comic using clean observational comedy to educate and entertain. In today's conversation, we're talking about the missing link to autoimmunity, functional genetics testing, and how empowering it can be to understand what's driving your inflammation so that you can heal your symptoms. Dr. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here.
I am excited for our conversation today, and I would love to start with you sharing a little bit of your journey about how did you become the friendly lab nerd, and how'd you get into functional medicine and
Sure.
all
Well,
the things?
I came to natural health the same way most comedians come to comedy, through tragedy.
Yeah.
And so I was very sickly as a kid, and I had a lot of problems growing up. It started with my parents' nuclear divorce when I was 6, where me and my siblings were caught in the blast radius, and that led to crippling insomnia. It was for over a decade, which actually stunted my growth. It was so bad. Really bad digestive problems, chronic pain from a lot of bullying and attacks in school, and really high stress at home, really high stress at school. Terrible diet. My parents did not understand nutrition at all, which made total sense because they were both psychiatrists. And
Oh, no.
their answer to all of my problems was that I was either making stuff up, seeking attention, or needed antidepressants. And basically, they're just giant psychiatric hammers looking for a nail.
Sure.
And
Two of them. That's
both of, I know, double jeopardy. I get
no
it.
wonder you're a comedian.
Yeah, the comedian, it could have been much worse. So what happened was that I got very sick, and what Western medicine had to offer me was not working. In fact, it was making things worse. And I decided in high school to take control of my health through natural medicine, and then found a mentor, and then went to college to do pre-med and a holistic health practitioner degree on weekends and evenings, and then ultimately went on to get my doctorate in chiropractic, got an acupuncture degree, became a functional neurologist for 8 years before I switched full-time to functional medicine, functional testing, and ultimately genetics. And so I'm a bit of a health mutt, a combo of multiple different fields. And I got into functional testing because I really liked having just data to work with. It suited my mind and the way my mind works. And I liked that there was a third-party lab that could verify data. And I really loved genetics. I started genetics back at the time of this recording 8 years ago. And at the time, I was doing lots of functional testing. Now, functional testing is not genetics testing in my world. Functional testing is checking, it's the thumbprint of what's going on in your body now. It's like, what's your hormone levels now? What's your amino acid levels now? What's your any active gut infections? What's going on in it, blood tests and so on. Whereas genetics is not telling you what's happening now. It's the filter through which what everything is happening now is passes through to express into its final form. And genetics will tell you how to optimally live, and also what are the risks that one is inherited that if you don't address now, you don't find out what those are now. You will find out eventually. And better to seal up the cracks in your genetic code as best you can now before they become a wider chasm. So both are very valuable, but they're different lenses into the system. And for me, what genetics did for me that changed my world immediately was in my 30s when I figured out, to really study genetics, I had chronic joint pain like an old man, like inflammatory joint pain. It was just awful. And I had these weird diet ups and downs and gut problems that had been plaguing me my whole life. And I had like an organic Portlandia Mediterranean diet where I knew the names of my farmers and their chickens. And I was having bloating, gut problems, weird energy crashes. And when I ran my genetics, I learned a couple things. One, I'm a hyper-inflamer genetically.
Mm.
And what that meant was that there's certain lifestyle tweaks that I only found out through genetics. One of those terms is called nutrigenomics, not nutrition, but nutrigenomics, which to help the listeners understand what that means, there's the nutritional dose of, say, fish oil, which is like 1 gram. It's like, and that's fine. It's great. 1 gram. Yay. Hooray. It's like widgets into the machinery. Nutrigenomic is when you have a much higher amount of a specific nutrient that doesn't just throw widgets into the machinery. It's changing the machinery. You actually change the genetic expression in a meaningful way with specific nutrients. So like the research shows that it's a minimum 2 grams of EPA DHA to create a nutrigenomic effect to mobilize the genes for inflammation to become more anti-inflammatory as opposed to just, some some fatty acids floating around with under 2 grams. So once I learned things like that, it's not just fish oil, there's other stuff as well. The joint pain, I was able to get the joint pain out. I was able to stop feeling pain in my joints for the first time in years. Additionally, I learned I was genetically not suited for Mediterranean style diet in terms of carb tolerance. I have the second lowest carb tolerance you can have. So I'm basically low carb paleo bordering on keto. And within 1 week of changing my diet, the gas, the bloating, and the weird energy cycling stopped. So the genetics radically changed my world in ways that the functional testing didn't. Again, functional testing is great, wonderful, do it all the time. It's a different lens. Other goodies I found out from genetics is that I have the gene for caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. Caffeine induced. Now, there's a percentage of people listening to this are going to like clench when they hear that. It's like, oh no, my life/business runs on coffee. What will I do? Like I get it. But it made me anxious and depressed. I was conflating energy with anxiety.
Right.
And that was a big problem. And there was other things that I found like histamine intolerance and other things that were very, very significant. But those were the big highlights. And once I saw that genetics testing is by far, without even a close second, the highest value test anyone can run on themselves in their entire life, because the results for your genes are permanent. So you just amortize over how many
you don't have to keep taking it. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, however many decades you plan on living, whatever you invest now in genetics is trivial compared to other tests that you have to keep redoing every 6, 12 months or whatever. So once I figured out how valuable genetics is, I've gone really, really heavy into it. And so that's how I got involved in genetics. And now you can just talk about so many different things like autoimmunity and other subjects from a genetics lens and really empower people.
Which is amazing. And I love it. Almost all of us got to this place through our own healing journey, and then we get to pay it forward and impact others.
Right.
Can you explain for listeners, when you say genetic testing, like if somebody had, ran their 23andMe, or are you talking about like if they went to their PCP and said, I want to do a, genetics test, is that what you're using, or is it different?
Not quite. So there's many types of genetics tests. There's everything from like what percentage Irish you are to
Right.
like paternity for legal cases. And then there's like super niche genetic testing for very highly specific genes that are a very deep concern for individuals. Like if you've got the risk for Huntington's or
Yep.
Down syndrome or whatever it might be. Those are really niche genetics tests. That's not the stuff I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like, I'm not even hunting for genes that cause a specific disease.
Right.
Like, that's more like the germ theory approach to genetics, where it's one
This
germ,
one thing.
one
Yeah.
germ causes one disease.
Right.
And so Western genetics is like, we got to find the one gene that causes one disease. And that's different from functional genetics, which is looking at what are the gene clusters of not the disease, but the drivers of the diseases that sit above the diseases, so that if you look at the drivers of disease, you're looking upstream and looking at a higher order of the genes to look at that's going to be beneficial for whatever your health goals and objectives and performance objectives are long term. So I'm looking at really only about 100 to 115 genes tops out of the 30,000. And those 100 or 100 plus are follow four very specific criteria. One is that they fall into one of the seven drivers of diseases, which is inflammation, free radical damage in the mitochondria specifically, liver detox, vitamin D receptors, meaning your ability to use vitamin D,
Mhm.
methylation. Spoiler, it's more than just MTHFR.
What?
I know, shocking. I think I actually figured out why MTHFR is so popular. But I did like three other podcasts just on methylation to rebut Gary Brecka's insistence these 5 genes for your methylation are all you need, and that just caused
Gotcha.
a storm. And
Yeah.
I got upset and
We
decided to fight with
we
podcasts.
we say that MTHFR it's kind of like bell-bottom jeans. Like it's back up on a peak now where everybody thinks that's what,
But the
that's what's
reason why it
causing
got
all their
onto it,
things.
I think the reason why it got up there was that it was the equivalent of a founder's effect. That MTHFR was really like the first public gene for functional genetics that just like
Right.
hit the zeitgeist, and it's never like it's gone from like gold place to like bronze medal. It's like gone up and down,
Up and down. It's
but
up right now. I feel like
it's
I've had
up.
it.
But that's
Yeah.
because of Gary Brecka. It's because he was on Joe Rogan and he talked about, oh, you need these 5 genes of
Oh,
methylation. And I was like screaming into my podcast, report. I was like, what are you talking about? So anyway, if people are interested in going down the nerdy methylation rabbit hole, I've got like 3 podcasts on my YouTube channel on methylation where I rebut Gary Brecka's claims. But anyway, but methylation is it's part of the 7. And then there's cardiovascular circulation, and then there's fat energy metabolism. So those are the 7 drivers. And by the way, they're in order of hierarchy. Inflammation is at the top of the file, which, by the
right.
way, spoiler alert for those methylation podcasts, inflammation regulates methylation. It's not really the other way around. So,
Ah,
so methylation is downstream from other processes and like inflammation. So when you look at the most important genes, do they fill in the gaps? Are they part of those 7? Are they part of those 7 major drivers? Are they the upstream genes of those drivers? So there's hundreds of genes that relate directly, indirectly to inflammation. I'm interested in the top 15 that control the rest. Then I want to know of those genes that control which of them have at least 10% variation in the population, meaning at least 10% has a red or yellow dot. I'm not looking for the 0.001% obscure gene, which
Right.
is important to that person for sure. But
Sure.
that's the geneticist niche, like that's the PhD niche expert on that gene,
Right.
that it is good for them, but it's not the broader strokes I'm looking for.
Hmm.
And the fourth criteria is, do the genes have peer-reviewed research done on
Oh,
humans in good journals that show that lifestyle, diet, nutrition alone shifts the epigenetic expression of that gene for the better. Now, epigenetic expression is jargon for, is the gene behaving well or is it rebelling?
yeah.
And genes are, think of them like dimmer switch. They can get brighter, they can get dimmer. And so good lifestyle will rotate the dial towards more brighter expression, and poorer lifestyle will move it towards a dimmer expression. But people have different dial settings. They have different end and beginning ranges. That's what the variation is. So you can have a red dot, which means a bad copy from mom and a bad copy from dad, and you've got a bad gene. But with good diet, lifestyle, nutrition, etc., your red dot, your bad gene, can behave more green-like. It can behave more like a green dot. It will never be a green dot, but it can behave more like it. And the reverse is also true. You could be
Sure.
blessed with a bunch of green dots, and you can have a really bad lifestyle, diet, nutrition, and the green dot will careen backwards
Right.
into behaving like a red dot. So
That's the whole point of all of this, right?
correct.
Especially
Correct.
as we're talking about autoimmunity. I know listeners have heard it a million times, as of anybody who knows functional medicine, but you know, the environment really is the trigger. I care what your genetics are so that we can create the right lifestyle for you. But the whole, my mom, my aunt, and my cousins all have RA, so I'm just doomed. No, you're
No, you're not.
not. This is why you're not.
No, that's the difference between functional genetics and Western genetics.
Yeah,
Western genetics can have the vibe of nihilistic fatalism.
right,
It's like, oh, I'm doomed,
right.
whatever. And for people who can't tell, I'm on the spectrum. So in fact,
They
I
can't tell.
I use lots of fun Scrabble words because words. And I'm also a stand-up comic as well, and it's just fun to play around with. The other thing is I decode some of the jargon because I trust the intelligence of my listeners and my clients. That part of the problem of any ivory towered profession, whether it's medicine, law, clergy, engineer, whatever, they create this cloak of confusion with polysyllabic words. And I can't stand that. Even though I love polysyllabic words. Love me a $50 Scrabble word. Love it. But the thing is, the whole point of a profession is to empower the people who benefit from the profession and
Right,
aren't in the profession. I'm quite comfortable decoding some jargon heavy words, because then whoever you go and do your genetics with, you will be more empowered and not overwhelmed with the jargon. So when people talk about Western genetics, is the vibe of nihilistic fatalism that you should just give up now.
right.
Where
Why
functional
bother?
why bother? Functional genetics is, no, there's a lot of gray space and a lot of things we can do that's going to minimize the risk of whatever you've inherited. Best example, the terrifying BRCA2 gene. 50% of all women, at least according to the last statistic I looked up on it a couple of years ago, 50% of all women who have BRCA2 never get breast cancer.
Right. We don't talk about that.
No. So
Yeah,
you don't. So before people Angelina Jolie themselves, understand that there are genes. That's an example of that gene that's more downstream of those seven drivers. Like, I don't test for BRCA2. I don't do it because that is downstream. I'd
right.
rather look at the ones that are upstream. So if people are going to use, it is possible to use 23andMe and Ancestry, as long as it's not like from like, whatever, 2005 or something, because there's genes have been updated and
Sure.
the different clusters and so on. So the thing about it is that there's two types of genetics testing people need to be aware of. One is variant testing, which is what 23andMe and Ancestry and what we're talking about, like green, yellow, red dots. Do you have a good copy, a so-called homozygous wild type, which means that you've got two good copies, and then there's the yellow dot, which is called heterozygous, hetero meaning different. So you've got a mixture. So you've got one good copy, one bad copy. Doesn't matter whether it's from mom or dad, just one or the other.
Right.
And then you've got a homozygous variant, which
Unless
is
you're like my kids and you want to point the finger, then it matters.
then that's
I tell
funny.
them no charge for the genes I passed on.
That is hilarious. So this genetics testing is the one time you can legit blame your parents. That's the
Totally.
one time you could. All right. So when you've got, so the variant testing is looking for the good, bad, and like yellow dot, which really it doesn't mean it's in between or it's in the middle.
Right.
Yellow dots are generally considered less worse red dots.
Right.
Not
Because
slightly,
it's still a, yeah.
it's still a variant. It's not slightly less benign green dots. And
Right.
and what's funny, this talk about humor. So this is funny when people get their reports and they see, a mixture of green, yellow, red dots or whatever, their relationship to the yellow dot is their emotional relationship to the red dot is actually based on this is true. So just bear with me. This is based on, do they trust their government? So hear me out. Hear me out. Hear me out. Because if you are in Europe, the northern European countries love their governments, like the Scandinavia and all that. So they obey the laws. When they see a yellow light, this is related to traffic lights. When they see a yellow light, they press the brakes. Okay. Now let's go a bit south in Europe. You say, I don't know, Italy, right?
Do they have brakes in Italy?
That's funny. And they do not like their government. They don't like Mussolini couldn't even corral his own government. Like, and so when they see a yellow dot, that means press the gas harder. Like that's so people's emotional relationship to the yellow dot relates to their relationship with traffic, which relates to their relationship with authority. Isn't that interesting?
I love that. That's really fascinating. Yeah.
So if you have 23andMe and Ancestry, you have green, yellow, red dots, which gets so much information. Problem, it misses the copy variant. It means the copy variant analysis. Copies variant analysis is it's a three-dimensionality to genetics almost no one knows about, talks about, or much less can use. So the three-dimensionality is not the type of gene you've got, but the number of duplicates of the gene in between the start and the end point of when the enzyme reads the gene. So it like makes duplicates of that enzyme or whatever it's protein, whatever it's making. That's relevant when it comes to assessing what your carb tolerance is. So that carb tolerance test is not a variant test. You can't get that from 23andMe or Ancestry because it's not looking at duplicates of the gene, just the version of it. The best way to understand this is imagine your digestive system is a medieval fort, and you've got the Visigoths charging the gates, and you've got, a number of cannons on the wall of the fort. So the cannons, the version of the cannon is the cannon or green, yellow, or red dot. So does the cannon, in this case, the cannon from the codes for salivary amylase, the enzyme that breaks down carbs. The Visigoths are carbs charging your intestinal tract right now. So the version of the cannon will shoot out like 90 things an hour versus 100 versus 95. In this case, the green, yellow, and red, like the green say is 100, the yellow is 95, the red is 90. In this gene, the actual difference between green, yellow, red is trivial. What's not trivial is the number of duplicates of the gene. I'd rather have 5 red cannons than 1 green cannon. It's the difference between like 500 and 450. Now, those numbers I'm just making up just for sake of illustration. Right. The number of cannons matters way, way more than the version, way more. So for me, the human body can have up to 20. Very, very, very rarely can go higher. The genetics companies found like a 22 once, maybe a 24, but it's between 1 and 20. I'm a 2. I have two cannons. That's it, just 2.
Oh boy, and, you better treat those cannons well.
Well, that and also minimize the environmental input of too many carbs.
Right.
So for me, my carb issue was not a quality because all my quinoa
Right.
was soaked in organic and picked by left-handed monks on the last harvest. Blah blah blah. It wasn't a quality issue; it was a quantity of carb issue.
Right.
So people can get a lot of information out of the 23andMe ancestry, but there's some other novel things in genetics that would need a fresh cheek swab to analyze these this in this one in particular, your carb tolerance. Like, are you keto, are you paleo, are you Mediterranean, or are you high carb?
Is this one like something that people could order for themselves, or is this why
uh
people need to come see someone like you?
well, right now, I have to send the swabs off to Australia, and so right now I do this test here in the US. And I have to like gather up the swabs and then bundle them off and send them off to Australia. Right at the time of this recording, I'm
Mhm.
working with a lab to onshore a a genetics lab in the States to do this in the States to cut down turnaround time and
And
logistics.
probably cost eventually,
It
you
definitely
would
costs.
think.
So it definitely costs, but it's just the real thing that people struggle with is right now it's about an 8 to 10 week turnaround,
Oh,
which
wow. But
which is
still, it never changes. So,
right. That's the perspective I want people to hear. It's like
yeah,
you're not going to lose fidelity of the data. The data will last you for decades. Waiting an extra month and a half to 2 months
right.
beyond the normal other test, it's fine. But we have a real patience problem in this culture. So we're
Give me the
working
magic pill now.
now. Exactly. So that's where 23andMe ancestry and so on, they're useful, but there is a niche portion that they miss. And if people don't have 23andMe ancestry, they don't, I also do the variant analysis as well. Not the full giant thing that 23andMe ancestry does, because I
The
only
useful
look at
stuff.
those. Well, they're useful for health. I mean, some people may
Right.
want to know what percentage Irish they are, and
Oh, sure. It's fun.
everybody.
Yeah. I mean, my family's all Ashkenazi Jews, right? So there's things you do want to know about your genetics, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
Yeah, we're talking about everything Dr. Sam is saying for listeners, if you haven't picked up on it, directly relates to autoimmunity. Remember that hierarchy. Inflammation was that
Yeah.
top piece, and inflammation is what's driving your autoimmunity. So,
Yeah, I can speak a bit more specifically to that. So if people are concerned about autoimmunity, there's three. When I went through IFM, my certification for IFM, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was like the major autoimmune researcher who lectured live, and he said that there's three requirements for an autoimmune disease.
yep.
Number one is you need the whatever is going to with the trigger.
Mhm.
So for let's just pick Hashimoto's for example, because there's a couple of
Common.
triggers there. So that those triggers can be H. pylori, it could be gluten, it can be blastocystis hominis, it can be a couple other infections. So you need the trigger, you need exposure to the trigger. Then you need the leaky gut for the trigger to leak through into the bloodstream, and then you need the gene specific to creating the antibody to attack that trigger. And the antibodies they're not heat seeking missiles, they're shape seeking missiles. And they will attack the trigger, but also any human cells that look similar in full or in part to whatever that trigger was. It's equivalent to like a Bloods, Crips, turf warfare, and you happen to be wearing a red shirt and you wander into Crip territory,
It's not a
or you
good
wear blue
choice.
and you walk into a blood territory, you just get caught in the crossfire because they think you're on the other team. So my
This is
uh
what we call molecular mimicry for those that
mimicry,
have heard
correct.
that term.
Yeah,
Yeah.
molecular mimicry. So the where genes comes in is in two of those three steps. The last step is, do you have the gene to make the antibody? That's not the genes I'm looking at. I'm looking at the genes that would provoke the cause of the leaky gut in the first place. That's where the gene tests that I look at. is relevant to autoimmunity. It's like, what are the things that drive a leaky gut, allowing the triggers to even leak through in the first. The triggers can't get through into the bloodstream, then there's no molecular
Right.
mimicry. So I'm looking at the second layer, which is the leaky gut layer, and what genes directly or indirectly influence the integrity of that gut. So the specific gene clusters, and before I get into naming genes on a first name basis, is first off the inflammation, which was at the top, the number one on top. So the genes that regulate inflammation are absolutely critical for maintaining gut lining integrity. Number two, you would look at the genes for free radical damage scavenging in the mitochondria, because I mean, you can literally go on to PubMed and just type in like free radical damage autoimmunity and just like look at paper after paper after paper. And there's three specific genes in the mitochondria that code for the enzymes to clean up the free radicals. And to make the image easier for people to understand, the mitochondria, you've heard this like the electricity factory or the power plant of the cell, but I'm not sure people really get just how big of a deal that is. 10% of your body weight is this factory. Imagine a cell is a city. Now imagine 10% of the entire footprint of the city is the electricity factory to run that city.
Right.
Now imagine that that electricity factory burns protein, fats, and carbs in the presence of oxygen to generate the electricity. Literally, that's why we breathe, is to provide oxygen for this 10% of your body weight of your cells to generate the electricity to run the rest of the cells. That's important because, if New York lost electricity, it would be about 3 days until it turns into Mad Max. So you need to have, if you need to have the electricity. So the problem is that 95% of all free radicals are generated in that mitochondrial factory. Think of free radicals as sparks that fly off the burning of the fuel, the burning of the protein.
Think of a factory.
It's just the spark. Yeah, so you got sparks in there, but now you need janitors running around putting out these sparks so it doesn't catch on fire. That's free radicals leads to inflammation. So the enzymes are MN-SOD, GPX1, and CAT, or for catalase. MN-SOD for manganese, not magnesium, manganese superoxide dismutase. That's what it stands for. He's the head janitor. I call him Mr. SOD, not MN-SOD. He's Mr. SOD. And if he has a variant, if he's got a yellow red dot, he's a bit slow on putting out the sparks. So if someone has a red or yellow dot in, say, MN-SOD, they're at a higher risk for autoimmunity because they're at risk of their mitochondrial factories catching on fire. So that's mitochondria. Then there's liver detox, and then there's vitamin D metabolism and genetics. And so the vitamin D genetics is particularly interesting because you need vitamin D to keep the cells of the intestine closely tight together, which is the opposite of a leaky gut. A leaky gut means that, the cells are lined up like shoulder to shoulder, but if they're like pulled apart, the gap in between the shoulders, that's the leakiness of the leaky gut. And it's vitamin D that helps keep the cells in the intestines shoulder to shoulder. So understanding your vitamin D genetics is critical because if you have weaknesses in your vitamin D metabolism genetically, then there's very specific things you can do nutritionally, not just take more vitamin D. There's other things you have to do to keep those cells of your gut shoulder to shoulder. And then there's other genes like, there's other genes involved, like methylation has its own role in autoimmunity, cardiovascular circulation genes. That is a very close relationship to poor cardiovascular health and the promotion of autoimmune disease. So if you look, and then the other piece on genetics is that if you know your genetic diet, like mine is like low carb paleo, then you're not going to trigger inflammatory responses,
through diet.
Through diet. You can also genetically identify, part of the 100 genes is also these genetic trigger foods. Are you genetically vulnerable to histamine, which is, that's about as close to inflammation it's like inflammation adjacent as far as I can tell. If you're sensitive to histamine, you're genetically, then histamine foods are going to create this kind of slow moving, I call it a slow moving bee sting through your whole body. Because histamine, bee stings your arm. The bee didn't inject a half quart of water into your arm. But what the body did, it's like, oh, look, a really concentrated dose of venom. We're going to
Right.
pull
Let's,
the switch.
yeah,
The flood switch is called histamine. We're going to flood the area with water to
let's dilute it.
it. That's histamine is, I think, the evolutionary's response to venom, whether it's a
Yep.
bee sting, scorpion, centipede, spider, fly, certain plants got, whatever insects, it's your emergency switch to venom to flood the area quickly, perhaps
Right.
disastrously, but flood it quickly because that venom is going to cause problems no matter what. And the problem is that there's foods that are high in histamine or that trigger more endogenous or internal creation of histamine or that shut down the enzyme that breaks down histamine. So if you eat any
Right.
of those three types of foods, you're basically creating a slow moving bee sting in your whole body, and you're going to create this global inflammatory response that is going to affect your gut and going to affect your immunity and your inflammation overall. So those are just some of the examples of how genetics absolutely relate to autoimmunity.
Yeah, I love that analogy because it's the same with, we talk about inflammation. It's the same thing. Our acute inflammatory response that protects us, saves us, heals us. We're talking about the chronic inflammation, that kind of slow burn, and then eventually it catches up with you, or
Yeah,
can. Yeah,
inflammation is like we would die without inflammation, just like
sure.
we would die without histamine, we would die without
Yeah,
cortisol. And it's there for like acute situations.
yeah.
And the problem is that certain people genetically, the 15 major genes for inflammation, I broke them down into initiation of inflammation, propagation or sustaining or flaring up of the inflammation,
Hmm.
expanding it, and then there's putting the inflammation out. So there's different gene clusters. Some people are they really do a great job preventing inflammation from starting. I talked to a person yesterday about this. She had what I call the inflammation sandwich, where she had green dots in the cluster of initiation genes and
Hmm.
in the putting out of genes, but she had red dots all up and down the propagation. And what her lived experience was like, she's really clean and clear on her diet and her lifestyle, and she's a good. And then she steps out of line,
Uh-huh.
and then it just flares like
Wham.
crazy.
Yeah,
And then like it can come back down, but she gets these super demoralizing, like massive explosions of inflammation
right.
because that middle bit that turns a little flame into a bonfire is so hypersensitive.
Yeah.
So you can even look at someone's genetic clusters and look at how to help navigate their anti-inflammatory um, procedures or protocols, and fine tune them accordingly.
Yeah, which is so empowering, right? I mean, and sometimes even just that understanding of like, oh, this is what's been going on for
She was
my
very
lifetime, a
relieved.
decade, whatever.
She felt so validated. She
Yeah.
was
Well,
gaslit by all of her friends. Oh, you just need to diet and exercise more. No,
well,
the
and doctors and I say it all the time on the podcast. My disclaimer: I live with one. I love him. And he's amazing. But standard Western medicine approach is to gaslight because they don't have the answer. It doesn't fit the diagnosis medication box.
I don't know what you're talking about being
Yeah.
by two psychiatrists. I have no idea what it's like to live with two doctors. No idea whatsoever. Gaslighting? Never heard of it until kindergarten.
Yeah.
Oh,
You just didn't know the word for it till kindergarten.
I learned pretty quick. Yeah.
So oh my goodness. Well, Sam, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours about this. But we are at that point. I promised I would let you go on time today.
Okay, thanks.
So, and it could be what we
We'll
think
talk
it
again in
might
the
be, or
future.
it could be anything. But what is one step that listeners can take today to start to improve their health? Any one thing you want to share?
So if people haven't had their genetics done, have a health professional who is skilled in looking at functional genetics get a genetics test, because it is the single highest value test you will ever run in your whole life, with not even a close second. The genes are permanent. The data is permanent. There's more information about the genes that are but the genes themselves do not change. It is the single most important test you could ever run. I just encourage you to work with someone who's qualified to run functional genetics. It's that their focus is to empower you, not to scare you.
Right. Right. This is not doom and gloom. This
That's
is,
what I said,
yeah.
functional genetics, not the other side. And just like budget for it, plan for it. This year, give yourself the gift of getting your genetics run, and that gift is literally going to be the gift that keeps on giving.
Love it. Amazing. And for people that are listening on the go and aren't going to check out the show notes, where's the best place for listeners to find you?
Very easy. You put it drsamshay.com. I'm not spelled like a stadium. It's DRSAMSH.
Only the East Coasters know how to spell it that way anyway.
Right. SHA. You can put in Dr. Sam Shay, my website. I've got a free ebook, genetics ebook, and genetics mini course. It says on the website, or you can just drsamshay.com/genetics. I'm also all over YouTube. You can put my name in there. I've got playlists on genetics and functional testing. I've got my stand-up comedy playlist.
Yes, I was gonna throw that in there if you didn't. You guys need to check out Dr. Sam's comedy, and we'll have you back on to talk about, because it is one of my favorite topics, the healing power of laughter, and how comedy fits into all overall wellness, because it's important.
Absolutely. And in fact, my main objective with comedy is edutainment, that I talk about what it's like to live on the spectrum. And that's what my hour premiere comedy special is at the Fringe Festival. And as of this recording, it's going to be next week. And if someone had spent 60 minutes with me 30 years ago to explain how my spectrum brain worked and how to adapt to the normal world.
Nobody understood 30 years ago.
Technically, Dr. Asperger's work was really publicized. It was popularized in the West starting really in the 80s, and they actually made it into the DSM-4 and it became standardized diagnostic terminology in the DSM-4. I think it was 92 or 93.
I was going to say, now I'm aging myself, because my psychology training was all DMS-3. So
okay,
I'm like, wow, I guess it has
catch
been
up.
3
Come
decades.
on. Yeah, but there's a whole. I mean, I cover the whole the fraught history of the term Asperger's in the special. Like it has a pretty dark history to it. I'm actually trying to reclaim the word.
Good.
Because despite its dark, I mean, for just spoiler for people, Dr. Asperger had troubling ties to the Nazis, and they used the good doctor's work to justify the sterilization of quote undesirable children like me. But it's hotly debated whether Dr. Asperger was complicit. It is genuinely argued vigorously if he was complicit in that relationship or not.
But the reality is the work is the work. Like,
even more
doesn't
importantly,
lose value.
But even more importantly, I'm proud to call myself an Aspie, because it was ultimately and ironically Asperger's syndrome that brought down the Nazis. And I can prove it with 3 names: Oppenheimer, Einstein, and Turing. All of them had Asperger's. So I'm quite proud to be an Aspie.
You're in a good club.
well, it's the irony is, like, if he's Dr. Frankenstein and he named us as the monster, I'm happy to be Frankenstein's monster because we took him down.
I love it.
So I'm proud to call myself an Aspie, and that's one of my goals of the special, is to reclaim the word.
Which I think is amazing, because you give such perspective and understanding. And so I know I promised I probably won't make it in person to the special, but check out the comedy on YouTube, because like all good comedy, we learn a lot, right? In addition to the laughter and the healing, there's a lot more to it. So Dr. Sam, thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
For everyone listening, remember you can get those show notes and transcripts by visiting inspiredliving.show. I hope you had a great time and enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to Julie Michelson's Inspired Living with Autoimmunity. Did you enjoy this episode? Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to get a transcript of this and every other episode, just head on over to inspiredliving.show or click on the link in this episode's description. There, you can also find everything we discussed in this episode, including links and information about our guest. You can even send in your questions to be answered by Julie in a future episode. That's inspiredliving.show. Until next time, this is Julie Michelson's Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast, helping you take your power back.